Grüß, willkommen in einem Figurenspiel. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 17 of my figure gaming video series. In this video I'll be providing some guidelines on how to create good looking area terrain pieces for your playing area. However, before we can make any area terrain, we need to determine what we need. I've created a huge amount of area terrain pieces which I later discovered were either the wrong size, not enough of, too many, or I've never used. I will need to also cover exactly how many terrain pieces you need. Let's first start with a definition of what I mean by area terrain. Area terrain, as its name implies, is an area where some unique terrain exists. It has reasonable depth as well as length, and typically would not span, let's say, a 1 foot terrain tyres if players are using the system, or would not typically be much larger than a typical empty space on a area or on your playing area. In most cases, no larger than, let's say, 24 centimetres square. This, of course, depends on the scale of your playing area, as we will see later. At this point, I should point out there is a good range of terrain pieces you can purchase, mainly made of plastic, resin, or a wood-type material. This is how I started, and until you decide you want to place a lot of effort into the playing area, is the optimal solution for most gamers. My last video covered a number of commercially available terrain pieces which you could look at. However, even when buying area terrain, many of the questions I asked in this video is still important when you need to determine the size and type of the area terrain you wish to deploy. It's also very possible to use almost zero cost area terrain pieces such as books under a ground sheet, or pieces of felt, or cardboard, or even simple pieces of MDF which have been flocked. All these options have been covered in some of my earlier videos, and assume you wanted to get into the hobby with minimum cost and effort is certainly a good idea. The objective of this video is creating high quality area terrain pieces so your playing area still looks reasonably good. This can be done with commercial products. However, to match your playing area, you still need to paint and or flock those area terrain pieces. The four main questions you need to ask yourself is: what size, shape, type of area terrain do I need, and what quantity of each? Some of these questions are simple, but some are surprisingly difficult to answer. Let's look at the first question, which is the minimum size of an area terrain piece, which is normally based on the size of the bases or elements you are using in your game. If 6mm, it's probably 3 centimetres square. If 15mm, then you're looking at probably a 5 centimetres square, if not larger. This applies to other type of figure games. So DBA, Ancients, would need a 4 centimetres square, for example. Of course, such a size would have minimal value for most area terrain, and probably would never be deployed. The only case where such a small area terrain piece would be useful is a built-up area, such as a small village, farmhouse, etc. In order to understand this, we need to understand the types and purposes of area terrain on your playing area. All area terrain can be very loosely grouped into woods or foliage, difficult, and built-up areas. Woods are, as the name implies, trees. This could be open, closed, or unusually dense, such as jungle. Also within this grouping could be bushes, cornfields, and other foliage which provides some form of benefits. Swamp, where there is a lot of trees and mangroves, could also be classed as woods. Difficult, as the name implies, is difficult to traverse. Unlike woods, there will not be much foliage, trees, or brushes, but the terrain itself could offer some form of protection, such as with unusually rocky terrain. This could also include swamps, which mainly consist of muddy grounds, sand dunes, beaches, boggy grounds, broken grounds, rough grounds, and the list goes on. Built-up areas represents buildings. This could be a village consisting of single-storey wooden buildings, towns consisting of single-storey brick or two-storey wooden buildings, and finally cities, which consist of multi-storey brick buildings. Area terrain, in its most basic form, affects gameplay in three primary ways: observation, protection, and movement. Area terrain, or even the base terrain of playing area, can affect observation by affecting visibility ranges and lines of sight. Some terrain increases visibility, so in a desert or plains you may expect visibility ranges to be greater. However, this type of rule is typically quite rare. In most cases, terrain reduces visibility ranges, so enemies in open woods can only be seen at a reduced range compared with them being in the open. For example, trips in the open may be visible from 40 centimetres away, but if they're in an open woods, this is reduced to 20 centimetres. The other Another effect is line of sight. Some area terrain simply blocks any line of sight. In some cases, it blocks the line of sight if it traverses a specific distance through that area terrain. If area terrain blocks the line of sight, then it may make sense to having the minimum size equal to the base size. This is certainly the case of built-up areas. You could argue that hills and woods, which totally block lines of sight, could also use a similar size. If area terrain does not block lines of sight, or only does so after traversing a certain distance, then it's probably better to deploy a larger sized area terrain piece, possibly double base size. So in that case, if a base is 3 centimeters wide, a wood should be probably 6 centimeters square. Some area terrain can provide protection against fire combat and close combat. This could only occur if an element is taking advantage of cover, or it could occur automatically. Clear terrain could include minor terrain features which can provide protection if an element takes cover. Heavy woods would automatically provide protection, even when elements are not taking advantage of cover. In some cases, area terrain may be unable to provide any protection, even when if an element is taking cover, such as in a desert. Any terrain which offers some level of protection can be the smallest size possible, such as a built-up area, heavy woods or broken terrain. Apart from built-up areas, I tend to find the minimum size should be double element size, but this is entirely a player preference, and my view on this point has changed over time. The final effect is movement effects. We are not considering roads here, as they're linear terrain, but unusually flat terrain such as deserts or plain could allow elements to increase their movement when travelling through. This is rare, but some rules do allow for this. The more common effect is to reduce movement or to prohibit movement. This can be determined by what is moving through it. An element-sized piece of terrain which inhibits movement is less than useful. So once again, I would tend to assume minimum size should be probably around about the double element size. Thus, in conclusion, the smallest area terrain size would use the element width, which is 3 centimeters square if 6 mil figures. This would apply to built-up areas, hills and other line-of-sight blocking terrain. Although, apart from built-up areas, this may not be commonly used. As a result, ignoring built-up areas, the smallest area terrain piece should be double the base width, or possibly 6 centimeters square if using 6 mil figures. It should be noted that rectangles would also be very common, and maybe the standard shape players would select rather than a square terrain piece, especially if deploying difficult terrain. For the larger size, we should not go beyond 24 centimeters square, even if you are not using tiles. Area terrain larger than this becomes difficult to deploy if you have roads fixed in your terrain. However, I rarely use area terrain of this size, or which is basically 24 centimeters square, with the most common size that I typically use is around about the 9 centimeters square or 12 centimeters square, with a very small number of 15 centimeters square area terrain pieces, if I'm basically playing this for a platoon or squad scale micro armor set of rules. If I'm going down to company or battalion, my typical terrain size is 1 element wide by 2 elements deep, or 1 element deep, 2 elements wide. The ground scale can also affect the size of area terrain. If the ground scale is 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 2,000, the area terrain pieces will normally be much larger, which is the recommendations I've already provided. In such a situation, road density would also be greatly reduced, allowing for the placements of large open woods or dense woods. If the ground scale is between 1 in 5,000 and 1 in 20,000, the area terrain sizes would be much smaller. Thus, 1 element by 2 elements would be the typical size that I would use. When I first made area terrain pieces, I used to create rather unique shapes with lots of curves and irregular sides. However, after many games, I've concluded most area terrain pieces should be based on a simple square or more likely rectangle with the corners rounded. As all the sides are multiple of element sizes, you can always evenly fill in any area terrain piece. The corners of the element will protrude, but house rules can clearly cover for this. This makes the use of your area terrain pieces nice and neat. Larger area terrain pieces would allow for combat within them. The corners can be rounded much more than shown here to give them more a natural shape. It should be noted that the rules can affect area terrain sizes. In ancient rules, normally, if any part of an element is on the area terrain, it is affected by it. This is in the case the area terrain can be more, in this case the area terrain can be more irregular or rounded. But for World War II modern rules, elements normally can only benefit if they're entirely in the area terrain or mostly in the area terrain piece. As this video is, at least initially, mainly focused on World War II modern conflicts, I'll stay with that recommendation for the rules. I've covered a wide range of different area terrain types in earlier videos. Players can create terrain which looks realistic but will need to be moved around or replaced when elements occupy those spots. Or the terrain can be made to allow the element to be placed on top of it, such as flat top built up areas or woods. This is more an aesthetic choice. However, with hills we need to determine if we need layers hills or simple unlayered hills. Hills' main effect is to block line of sight or allow elements on a hill to look over line of sight blocking terrain, at least for World War II modern periods. Some rules provide a disadvantage if crossing or if you're launching a close assault up a hill, but this is comparatively rare, would only be used in, let's say, squad SCAR rules. So the question is, do we need layers as shown here? The main issue with layered hills is the edges are sharp and as a result don't really look very realistic. The answer depends on the rules, but generally the answer is yes, players should create layered hills. So how do we reduce the ugly sharp corners so that when you deploy them they don't look bad? One option is to create a 0.5 centimeter sloped lip for each level. This means our 2-level hill increases in size from 9 centimeters squared to 11 centimeters squared to allow for the sloped lip. Any hill smaller than this would be single level only. A level 3 hill would be 18 centimeters square, which would be very rare for a 1 in 5,000 scale game. However, this may be used as a ridge on a playing area. In this case, only half the hill is present. This does solve the aesthetic issue, but it's also obvious players could avoid using layered hills and simply create house rules to reflect different elevations. Just a point, I'm uncertain if I like the idea of increasing the size of the hill to accommodate a sloped lip, and I prefer staying within a simple multiple of base sizes. In this case, the element edge will slope off the hill, but this occurs with a deep base anyway. Nonetheless, having a sloped lip does make the hill look a lot better. The other option is players could create hills using multiples of 4 centimeters, which means I could also be used with Napoleonics. In fact, players could create all area terrain using 4 centimeter multiples for this reason, something that players will need to decide. There is one other issue we need to consider, that is hillcrest. Rules which do not cater for troops being behind a hillcrest do not need to be concerned with this, but for rules which do include this unique position, we need to ensure our hills contain a hillcrest. This requires the top hill to be at least 6 centimeters square, so elements behind a line running through the centre can be considered as being behind a hillcrest. There are other ways of dealing with this, such as assuming the hill crest runs through the centre, and as long as the element is behind this centre line, it can be considered as being behind the hill crest. That way the top piece of your hill only needs to be 1 element square. The only issue is your element will hang off the edge of the hill, and if it's a deep base, such as 4 centimeter deep, it may tip over. At this point, some gamers may be thinking that this simplistic approach of depicting hills is simply not realistic, and technically you would be correct. Actual terrain does not consist of a flat board with a few hills poking out, as we can see with this realistic depiction of terrain. We are not dealing with flat boards and a couple of things poking out of it. However, terrain on a playing area represents average terrain, or in the case of hills, on an existing, possibly sloping playing area. If you're playing on a gentle slope, it may well be a flat surface. However, when some form of hill pokes out, as we can see with this arrow, that does represent a militarily significant hill which needs to be depicted. So while I would love to game on a playing area like the one shown here, I lack a permanent gaming room which allows me to do it, and I have to live with reality. Players may also wish to close off the edge of your playing area with a line of hills. This represents area terrain which represents half a valley with a river in the centre and with difficult or rough hills on the right one of the flanks. The terrain is actually gently sloping up the hills, but the hills represent the boundary for the rough terrain hills. I normally use 3-level hills for this edge piece, but as I do not need to work around because I don't need to worry about the crest of the hill in this case, it becomes a fairly simple process. This image also gives you an idea of how much terrain you may need for a game. This is another example of playing area, in this case a very highly developed one with a line of woods closing off one flank instead of a river, and of course the hills on the other flank. In this case, each tile is 30 centimetres square, with the main terrain piece being 9 centimetre square. This is a 3 by 4 foot playing area designed to simulate a 1 in 10,000 scale game. If doubling this play area and changing the game scale to 1 in 7,500, then the playing area would remain the same, but each tile would be 45 centimetres square. That means the most common area terrain piece would now grow in size to be about 13.5 centimetres square. As you can see, if you change your ground scale, the area terrain can increase in size. I should note this playing area is for scales between 1 in 5,000 and 1 in 10,000, so there's a lot of flexibility when creating terrain density and considering terrain sizes. This shows an example of a 4 by 6 foot playing area, but it retains the 1 in 10,000 scale terrain density. I rarely ever use a playing area this size, unless I am using a set of rules which use a 1 in 5,000 ground scale and I need that room. We should also not forget the desert. This shows a dried wadi on one flank and a line of rough hills on the other. The road represents dirt tracks, but even in this type of terrain, hills are required and should be placed on the playing area. When trying to work out exactly what type of terrain you need and how much of each, draw out a typical playing area and insert the terrain pieces you feel are required. Using a table of the correct size and books to represent hills, woods or rough terrain can assist you in this determination. After studying this terrain and confirming its viability, you can now count the area terrain pieces you have placed, and hey presto, you have the list of area terrain pieces you need to create. If you try and buy or make every possible area terrain combination, you'll end up with boxes of area terrain which you'll ever rarely use. Using a typical playing area shown previously, based on the first example playing area, we have the following area terrain pieces. For built-up areas, 8 to 10, 3 to 6 centimetres square, 3 to 5, 9 centimetres square, and 1, 12 centimetres square. For woods, 6 to 8, 9 to 12 centimetres square, and 1 to 3, 24 by 9 or 12 centimetres square. For hills, 6 to 8, 9 to 12 centimetres square, and 1 to 3, 24 by 9 or 12 centimetres. For playing area edges, 4 playing area edge pieces and 1 optional end piece. The only real decision is if players use multiples of base widths, such as 3 centimetres, or larger multiples, which could also be used for Napoleonics on Ancients, which could be 4 centimetres. I have no real advice on this point, and I'm currently creating both sides of groups of terrain. Actually, after I created this initial set of videos, I have terrain pieces which are basically based on 3 centimetre element sizes, 4 centimetre element sizes, 5 centimetre element sizes, and 6 centimetre element sizes, all for different rules ranging from Ancients, Napoleonics, up to modern World War II. In the end, I had to create specific area terrains for every scale I was going to use. Incidentally, this list of terrain pieces that I'm displaying here is primarily designed for World War II modern platoon squad scale set of rules. If you're going to different scales, it could be a completely different list of area terrain pieces. And so this concludes my episode 17 of my figure gaming video series, in this case providing some hints on how to make game-friendly but reasonably good-looking area terrain pieces, specifically how many and what type of area terrain pieces I need. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.